So, what is a monastery? We asked that question and we visited one, and it was an interesting experience. And we're here to continue talking about it. This is Eric Slawick, aka the UWM Pen Guy, and
Alex Burks,
and
Elliot School.
And here we are again. So, in our last episode, we left off in like two-thirds of the way through monastic history. But Elliot, I was wondering what sorts of thoughts, because it sounded like you had some thoughts you wanted to share about kind of the medieval period.
Yeah, no, for sure. Just thinking about, like inside these orders, like Saint Benedict, he was kind of the founding member of Western monasticism. He was not well liked amongst his followers. I mean, for whatever reason, but his rule of life was very, very strict. This shedding off of the world, the removal of wealth, everything being communal. That leads to a lot of like jealousy amongst people. Like you remove people's entire ways of life, how they've been living, since before they got there, at whatever age. The older you get, the harder it is to switch, which is why most monasteries don't accept people under the age of 30. But that new way of life is very difficult to jump right into. So Saint Benedict instituting a very strict rule in fasting and prayer was not well liked. So much so that they even tried poisoning him at dinner just to kill him. But they wanted that prestige that came with being a monk in the church and amongst the people. So seeing how that kind of counterculture across the ages, that was over 1,000 years ago. Seeing how it was not well liked then, going against the world and the way that people were living, how much more so now too.
Yeah, and okay, so my initial idea, you're basically saying from the last program about this being kind of all these different orders arising were basically one countercultural movement after another. Cut out my entire previous comment. So basically you're saying that these were essentially countercultural movements, the various orders that arose over the centuries.
Yeah, and people, you have to have that calling, to go out into the desert, to remove yourself from a worldly life. That is not for everybody. Looking at like the rule of St. Augustine, they talk about, he talks about how the rich are given more than the rich who enter the monastery are given more than the poor who enter the monastery because of their old way of life. They are considered the weaker of the members of that monastery, just because it's such a hard turn from their old way of life. It's 180, completely different. So they have to, reacclimatize this new way of life because it's so different. The rich and the poor alike. It's not so much like the culture is really it's for all people, but it seems like the wealthier you are, the more the culture impacts you. Because the poor, they have nothing. Like they're more worried about finding food, about finding shelter, about finding water. So having that jump from monastic life is really hard. But having the jump from living that culture at the time, living in whatever situations, like whether it was like a pagan society or a society where they were kind of just starting off as Christians and not really kind of getting into the groove of what it means to practice that in society. That jump is always difficult, and it's countercultural because at the most fundamental level, we need food, we need shelter, we need water. We're not used to living in communal life. We're used to living, maybe in a small family, small group of friends, or alone with a spouse. Especially now, we have pretty much everything given to us, and we can go down the road, go to the store and get all the food you need. You don't have to share anything if you don't want to. So anything that goes against even those very common cross-cultural and historic threads, that is definitely a jump. I guess a specific example would be like a cultural belief, like in southern France, the Albigensians, Saint Dominic, who started the Dominican order, was called by God to go and like tamper out this heresy that was, you know, ravaging southern France. Like basically they believed that the body was bad. They believed that like if you were baptized, right, and you sin after that, you lose your salvation. So Saint Dominic, all these Albigensians were like encouraging suicide, or like fasting to the point of death. They were going against like the teachings of the church and claiming that they were part of the church. So Saint Dominic, moving counterculturally, went there and preached the truth to them, and in doing so gathered a following and started his own order.
Interesting. So I remember in studying medieval history, these are usually referred to as reform movements. Would this perhaps, from the Catholic way of thinking, be comparable to in the Old Testament, when in the books of Kings and Chronicles in Okay, I'm going to try not to overload this with information, but my analogy needs a little context. The kingdom of Israel split into about pretty early in its history, and then the northern half was completely departed from God, never looked back. But the southern half would be a constant seesaw of faithfulness and apostasy and idols and God, and it became a real mess. And then there would be kings like Asa and Jehoshaphat, Josiah was another one, and there were a few others, Hezekiah, and they would come along and they would clean house, almost literally. They would tear down the idols, they would reinstitute the Passover, rebuild the temple, make a covenant with the people to follow God as which was essentially kind of a renewal of the covenant they made at Mount Sinai. And God would be pleased with it, at least in the context of the old covenant and the way God related to his people at that time. But these kings were kind of the monumental figures of Jewish history, along with the judges and Moses. And so is it something like that? Is it something like seeing the corruption in society? Not that obviously the kings were active and they were attempting to like force a change on society, but was it the kind of the same impulse, maybe more inwardly directed?
Yeah, I mean, looking at how like monasteries and religious life as a whole, it's like a rock in the society, because they don't change. You know, they have their rule, they follow their rule, and God willing, their abbot or whoever is their superior is a faithful individual and who is following like the teachings, following the truth, who is faithful to Jesus. So they are that continual rock through society that go out and try to change the things, be useful to God. As Alex said in the last episode, they are enacting the will of God. And obviously, like some are, some orders, they're cloistered. They don't go out into the world. They're in their monastery. They pray for the world. But others, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, they go out into the world and they share the gospel. They try to enact the change for all of the things that they see wrong in the world. And think about those ebbs and flows in society in the kingdom of Israel. It's the same thing with us. We do the same thing in our life. We grow closer to God, but then we start sinning, and then we regress, but then we get back on our journey, on our path, on the race, and we start pursuing once again, and we fall, and we repent, and we pursue. And it's this cycle, this ongoing growth that we have to go through. And I guess in a sense, not in a sense, but like the church being Christ's body on earth, the members of the church being Christ's body on earth, that's the rock, that's the thing that stays constant while the whole world is kind of ebbing and flowing. Because the church doesn't conform to the culture. The church tries to make sense of it.
And so just because okay, and that makes sense. And because the Dominicans and Franciscans in particular, weren't they both started under the idea that the church itself had wandered so far astray that they were seeking to by both word and deed and example kind of call the church back to its original intention?
Yeah, well, did you have more thoughts, Eric?
No, that's what I've read in medieval history books. That's why I brought up the idea of a reform movement, that they were basically reform movements at the beginning.
Well, I would say that everyone thinks of the Catholic Church in terms of hierarchy. And so at certain times you do have those big top-down reformed movements, at a few different points in church history. I would say that what you see you're describing are what's called the Mendicant orders. And so that was a more grassroots movement of the people that eventually made its way up into the foundations or the higher echelons of the church. So, like you mentioned a couple times, Elliot, due to the fact that the monasteries were very wealthy and they were kind of like little cities inside of, the countries, this often did lead to sometimes a lot of staleness and a lot of worldliness that crept into the monasteries. Mm-hmm. And so what the Mendicant orders wanted to do was take the good of the monastic idea and take it out of the monastery and bring it into the world. And so St. Francis was kind of the first person who really embodied this in his actions. And so the interesting thing about St. Francis, we can see the rise of modern capitalism in his life because his father was a cloth merchant. And so he was very wealthy as far as it is the 1200s. So 1200s Italy is concerned. He was doing pretty well for himself. And he left his life of prestige and privilege in order to basically become a hermit. He wanted to be homeless. He didn't want to have any possessions. And eventually people just followed him because they found his way of living so inspirational, to say, I own absolutely nothing, right? And even he was trying to do something even more dramatic than what the monasteries were doing, where not only do we own things communally like the first Christians, we own absolutely nothing. And we wear clothes because we must, wear clothes so we don't freeze to death, and we wear sandals so we don't split it. It's very much like, what do I need to get from A to B today and to do the will of God? And so the Franciscans are called the monks in the marketplace. So they went out into the marketplace and they preached the gospel to the common man. And St. Francis walked, from Assisi to Rome, and he asked the Pope, actually Pope Urban II, who started the Crusades, funnily enough, can I get papal sanction for this? And you would think that this, wealthy man would, the wealthy, opulent prince of the Catholic Church would say no, but he said, I see the Lord. I see the Lord in you. I think you're doing a great thing. And so the Franciscans continue to grow. And so the Franciscan movement was very clear because the Lord, when he spoke to St. Francis, apparently said, rebuild my church, was falling into disrepair. So there's a couple meanings to that. But yeah, in that sense, the Franciscan movement was let's get back to the basics of the gospel. The Dominicans, like you mentioned, Elliot, are very different because they were sanctioned. They were kind of released, and it's very militaristic how the movement was sent to the Albigensians, because they were calling crusades all the time at this point in history, and they thought, well, instead of sending a crusade, let's send preachers to preach to them, to tell them the error of their ways. And so that was the idea of St. Dominic's order. And so it's interesting to see how this is played out throughout history, because the Franciscans are wearing poor brown habits and following in simplicity and caring for the poor, caring for God's creation in very humble ways. And the Dominicans are called more to preach, or to contemplate God, to study God, and to go to others and to pour forth that contemplation in from their minds. So it's the Order of Preachers is the official name for the Dominican order.
Interesting. So, why don't you actually bring us up then to the modern day? Because obviously when you had the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, the Age of Exploration, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of humanism, these are all obviously going to have a major impact on the history of monasticism. If for no other reason than the culture that they're seeking to change and or separate from and or preach to is changing so rapidly after roughly, let's just thumbnail it at the year 1350 or about 2/3 of the way through the Middle Ages. Am I right in thinking most of the orders we have today were pretty well underway by about 1350?
I would say it's a bit later than that, where things get formalized, maybe into the 1500s, before the Protestant Reformation, a couple hundred years before that. So, actually, you probably had a pretty good chunk of, a couple hundred years after Francis, before Luther, Martin Luther, where all of Europe was Catholic. All of Europe was Christian. And so you had so many religious orders, and the monasteries were full, and people were coming with all sorts of different religious orders. And even after the Protestant Reformation, it's interesting to note that Luther was a monk. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk. So just to show you how common this was, that people who were doing the thinking in the church were the monks in the monasteries, right? So, of course, after the Protestant Reformation, Protestants kind of not having a need for the monastery system, most of them kind of jettisoned it, right? But in places where Catholicism flourished, you just had orders popping up and some dying off. But when you had a predominantly religious Catholic society, you had monasteries that were full, even up until the maybe the 1950s and 60s. You have so many stories of saints in the modern day, such as Saint Maximilian Kolbe, who died at Auschwitz, who was a Franciscan, and other saints who died in the Holocaust. Actually, none come to mind right now, but it was a very common thing for people to be in monasteries. But as society secularized and we got closer to the Second Vatican Council, things radically changed. So the numbers started dropping off as we move kind of away from the early 1900s into the kind of the mid-century time period. And then after the council, things really changed. After the Second Vatican Council, things really changed for monasteries, and you had a lot of monasteries modernizing. And so a common theme is that the sisters and the brothers were taking off their habits. And so if you meet a sister nowadays, it's kind of not infrequent to see sisters wearing pantsuits or something like that. Or, it's a strange thing to see, but you'd be like, I'm an avowed sister, but I don't show it externally, right? And so you had a laxening a lot of rules in the monasteries, and a lot of monastery or religious orders dying out completely, because we might have had 200 on the books religious orders, but the 50 that are kind of the bedrock and go all the way back weren't even meeting numbers, right? So I would say the current trend in the Catholic Church is we still don't have an abundance of religious, but the religious religious is the term kind of as a noun, not necessarily a descriptive word. The religious that are coming in are far more traditional, and they're saying, I want a religious monastic life that is fully dedicated to its ideals. I want to wear a habit as an external witness that I am a person who's dedicating my life to Christ. And so if someone sees me I've heard a lot of, maybe Franciscan brothers talk about this, when they see me, they might mock me, but that's good, because unlike, a layman, I can't hide my faith. I am who I am. If someone needs confession, they see that I'm in a habit. They can ask if I'm a priest, then I can hear their confession, and I can be a living symbol for Christ. So it's very much, a lot of young religious want to make a public witness of that in their habit. And so in the East, because we visited a Byzantine Catholic monastery, it's very different. All of that to say, to jump off to whatever we talk about next, in the East, they don't have orders. You won't have all these various orders. You have the layman, you have the priest, and you have the monk. And the monks have different ranks, but they don't have different orders. So they basically all dress the same. They all kind of look the same aesthetically, and they all have kind of a similar monastic system that kind of, you enter in and you're tonsured, you make vows, you move, up into a brother, and you can kind of move, maybe you become an abbot. You may or may not be ordained a priest if you're a male monastic, and you move all the way up into what we still have hermits in both the Catholic and Orthodox Church, but in the Orthodox Church, they call their hermits, it's called the Great Schema. And so you are sort of in that hermit role. So it's just a quick overview of the difference in Eastern and Western Christianity.
So how exactly then were the Byzantines who re-entered the Roman communion able to, like, how did they fit in it? Because you said it happened in the 1600s, largely after the fall of Constantinople. And which for anyone who needs the background, that was kind of one of the big pivot points in the history of Eastern Orthodoxy, because Eastern Orthodoxy is what was traditionally far more of a state religion than was the case in the West, because there was no single state left in the West after the 5th century AD. And so when the Byzantine Empire, or what remained of the East Roman Empire, finally was overrun by the Ottoman Turks, there was obviously an identity crisis for all Eastern Orthodox, as in, like, the emperor is still a central figure in our church life as it was all the way back to the days of Constantine, but there's no more emperor. And are you saying that the Byzantines are kind of reacting to that new reality by looking to the West? Is that part of it?
I would say it's a lot more grassroots than, top level dance of empires. It was missionaries going and persuading these Orthodox that of the Catholic claims. And so you had a lot of high numbers of people who were being convinced that Catholicism was true, but they were separated from kind of the main Catholic infrastructure. Again, this is in sort of Central Europe, and over from Poland, everything east of Poland, right? And so you just had large numbers of Orthodox faithful who are saying, we want reunion, we want to mend the schism. What does this look like? And the Catholic Church said it looks basically like you can maintain your various traditions. Now, there was a lot of bloodshed in this process, back and forth between the Orthodox and what they called the Uniates. So the Uniates were what we call Eastern Catholics. There's still a lot of tension there. But
by the way, if anyone has looked into the background of if someone's watching this 2 decades, and hopefully the war will be over by then, but a lot of Ukraine's identity crisis in terms of religion anyways comes down to exactly what we're talking about here. The Uniate Church is quite prominent in Ukraine, and it has always lived this tension between East and West as the essence of its national identity.
Precisely.
All right. So to tie this all kind of back together, so basically monasticism is it's a practice that arose as a protest of the world and as an attempt to turn from that secular carnality to pursue the spiritual life to the fullest extent possible. Is that a good thumbnail sketch?
Sure.
Okay. And over the centuries, it developed and grew and multiplied in the West, whereas in the East, it kind of remained pretty uniform over time.
Mm-hmm.
So what we encountered at the monastery, I guess functionally, it was an Orthodox monastery, except it acknowledged papal primacy or the headship of the Pope over the earthly institution, right?
If that's how you want to think about it.
Well, I don't know. Well, I mean, because literally the only thing I saw there that was Western Catholic was a picture of John Paul II, and I think you guys mentioned that they prayed for some Catholic officials during the divine liturgy. Otherwise, it felt like, and I'm going to use this analogy because I think it's accurate as far as it has value. When I worked at Pick and Save, there was a thing called a banner store. Pick and Save was a Kroger banner store. It was owned by Kroger. It sold Kroger products. It had Kroger oversight, and Kroger did reserve the right to change things when they felt it was necessary, when there was a company-wide initiative or something. But they didn't do it all that often. Sometimes they went overboard, but for the most part, they kept the management in place. They kept the systems in place because it would be silly to buy this company and then basically just make it into a different company if it's already doing well in the region. Is that sort of kind of like the idea? If I completely missed the mark, let me know.
No, I don't think that's inaccurate. I think that's basically the idea. I would say that the goal is that it's a different entity, and so the distinctions are tried. They try to maintain the distinctions very sharply, because you don't want things getting commingled, and it's kind of a common theme in a lot of Byzantine churches to avoid Latinization, because that's not authentic to their tradition, right? So it's an interesting place to be in the middle world, but certain people think about this in different ways. So basically the idea.
Okay, and so in the big melee of orders that rose and fell in the West, inside the Catholic Church, is this order seen as, I guess maybe legally and or functionally on the ground? Are these orders then seen as just another of the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Carmelites, whatever it might be, or are they like in a different category?
They're in a different category.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it both, in the Western sense, it both is a monastic order and it isn't.
It's not an order. It's just it's because the churches are different, right? So you have Catholicism, and then you have the Latin rite, and then you have various other rites. You know what I mean? So these all the orders, they're in one rite, and in this rite, how monasticism is practiced looks like this. And so it's jurisdictionally, it gets kind of weird, but am I making sense?
Yeah. Okay. And so monasticism, I'll wrap up this episode with sort of this point, and then anyone who has thoughts can respond, and we'll conclude this episode. Monasticism, because I think that unless you live in or around Eastern Orthodoxy, most people think of monasticism and they think of the thing we covered in our big historical tangent. They think of the Western Rite orders. Mm-hmm. And so obviously the very existence of the Byzantines says a lot about, if anyone is, including me, is trying to understand what monasticism is, it says a lot about what, like, the nature of monasticism, that it can look, function, jurisdict so differently. And would you guys say that what we encountered there was still what you would call monasticism, right?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. And I guess I'll close with this. I'll throw this question out to both of you. Like, is it, I mean, how would you then see the, like, relative to what you were talking about, Elliot, with the Dominicans and the Augustinians and the Franciscans, like, how would you, I guess, like, how do you see these Eastern monks relative to that?
The beauty of, like, the Catholic Church being, like, not just Latin, you have that you have the diversity of thought, because we're all in this world. We're all trying to understand who God is and like who we are supposed to be in respect to that. They've come to a different understanding than what the Dominicans came to, like what St. Dominic came to, what St. Francis, St. Benedict, St. Augustine. They've all come to a different understanding, but it's all within this. It's the same truth. We follow Jesus. It's all under the Holy See. Like, we're all Catholic. It's just our expression of that is different. I think it's different than anything I've ever experienced, but it also possesses so much beauty, not just because it's different, but because of the traditions it holds and how like similar they are to like the Latin Rite, but they're just the way they're expressed is new. You don't see that. You only see, like, when I think of Catholic, I think of the Latin Rite. I don't immediately go to Eastern Catholicism. I mean, I didn't even know that there was other rites within the Catholic Church until a couple years ago. And now understanding this, you see, like, God just wants people to come to him, and those are just the ways that these traditions like found to come to him.
Okay, so you guys would see this as an example or a manifestation of the broader sort of New Testament idea of the both, I guess, the one body, many parts, but also the every tribe, nation, and tongue, that those who choose to follow Christ, kind of the struggle that you had in the early church over whether you had to be Jewish, look Jewish, think Jewish, and talk Jewish in order to be a Christian. You guys see this as kind of the existence of the Byzantine Catholics. You see as sort of a rebuke to that way of thinking.
Yeah, and looking at like what all that, like the guidelines for monastic life, it like for the most part it comes from Acts. Devoted themselves to being together, to the teaching of the apostles, to the breaking of bread. It's very simple. How that organically forms in each different culture is just an extension of what that means.
Okay, and on that note, I'll wrap up this program, and then next time we will do a rapid fire, perhaps, kind of round, or just a hot seat kind of round where we'll get a little. We've given the background. So until then, this is Eric Slaywick, the Pen Guy, and
Alex Burks,
and Elliot School,
and this has been a special edition of Pen Guy podcasting with my Catholic friends. So till next time.